Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. This week we're taking a look at a commander who is Ever-Watchful, near, far, wherever you Ranar. Ranar the Ever-Watchful is Kaldheim's premier foretell commander, reducing the cost of the cards we foretell from our hand, while also encouraging us to blink or to exile permanents from the field, supplying us with an army of spirit tokens as we do so. Ranar kind of snuck up on us last year. He was released in the same mini precon set as Lateral Blade of the Elves, which has shot up to be one of the top 20 most popular commanders in the format, which I think ended up overshadowing Ranar a bit. However, over the past year, Ranar has built up a proud following of nearly 2,000 decks, making him the second most popular Azorius commander to date. Let's get started by taking Ranar's average deck list as compiled by the average deck feature on EDHREC and importing it to the Architect deck building website. Remember that any swaps we make in this series must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. It has been foretold. This is pretty decent work. Good on you, Ranar. There are a high number of creatures here, which I'll admit surprised me at first. However, it swiftly becomes evident that Ranar highly values his creatures because he likes to blink them over and over again, temporarily exiling them, which means he makes a spirit token, and then bringing those creatures right back again to re-trigger their enter the battlefield effects. I think the more interesting number is actually the amount of foretell cards this deck contains. There are 27 total foretell spells in paper, and this deck contains 17 of them. 17 foretell cards is a pretty interesting number, but I will say right off the bat that the ones this deck isn't playing are generally pretty good calls. We've got the best of the bunch here, and then some. We'll examine that foretell number in greater detail in a bit, but for now I think it's most important for us to focus on Ranar's core cards. Naturally, there are some very exciting foretell spells here, like Alrund's Epiphany, Doomscar, and Cosmic Intervention. These aren't just good foretell cards, they're just good cards in general that a ton of other decks are using too. But even some of the others are pretty tricky as well, letting you live a full Yu-Gi-Oh! Fantasy by placing face-down trap cards with some wild effects that your opponents may not see very often, to totally catch them by surprise. Foretell doesn't foretell the entire story, though. I was originally going to say that this deck has a Blink sub-theme, but in truth, Blink is such a presence here that I don't think it's right to call it a sub-theme at all. And I should just call it a major driving force behind the deck's construction. Teleportation circles, flicker wisps, ephemerates, there's a lot going on here, promising that Ranar will consistently make a whole lot of extra tokens as we flicker our creatures for additional triggers. In fact, even our removal spells can produce extra tokens. Ranar makes spirits whenever we exile anything from the battlefield, not just whenever we exile our own stuff, so a Swords or a Curse of the Swine also have small upsides, which can add up over time. But of course, let's not forget the blink targets themselves, from classics like Wall of Omens and Cloud Blazer to repeatable removal like Amphin Mutineer. There's a lot of moving pieces here. Ranar revels in repeated re-entrances, gaining value not just from their enter the battlefield effects, but also producing additional tokens each time. It's at around this point that I think it's fair to highlight a question that I've seen many players ask when examining Ranar this closely. If this is an Azorius deck that uses blink effects, why not just play Brago? Brago is a blink engine, and if this deck is playing a bunch of those same blinky cards, why not just go with the more consistent flicker effect right there in the command zone? Forget the foretell and just go with the consistent value engine, right? In fact, I've seen further evolutions of this question that have even gone so far as to say that if you want to make spirit tokens, why use Ranar to do that when you can use the brand new Millicent instead, since she's so much better suited to a spirit token strategy, and her deck often contains way more ways to pump up those spirits to make them into a powerful attacking army. I think these questions are fair. Truth be told, I struggled a lot with them myself, and it's a sentiment that I saw echoed in all corners of the internet so often that I didn't think it would be right to make a Ranar video without addressing those questions. In fact, one of the things that made me want to make this video is precisely because I wanted to work through those same questions myself. In a lot of ways, Ranar seems to be a weird mix of Brago and Millicent. Heck, both of them appear in this average deck list. But when a deck is trying to do a bunch of different things rather than one specific thing, there's a genuine concern from players that a deck that divides its attention too much will end up not performing any of its missions as efficiently as a deck that focuses on just one specialized task. However, I will speak up for Ranar here because I think it's dangerous to take him for granted, and I also think he showcases an unexpected flexibility. Comparing commanders is useful to help discover nuances or differences in strategy and card choice, but I think we would be doing ourselves a disservice by labeling anything as better than another. For example, Brago may be the king of Blink, but a common critique of Brago is that his win conditions can take a very long time to actually close out the game, or that he sometimes has to focus on infinite combos to finally wrap things up. Regardless of power level, that is not necessarily the experience that everyone wants in an Azorius Blink deck. Some players may want a Blink deck that is capable of combo, but that doesn't feel like it has to combo, and can in fact still load up a very super punchy army to win the good old-fashioned combat way. That alone is a very appealing reason to choose Ranar as your commander compared to other Azorius options, and that is the mindset that I'd like us to carry forward in this upgrade. Thus, I think it's time we get to business. Ranar has already predicted our 3 categories for upgrades, and they're going to be just a little different than usual. In Section 1, we'll discuss some removal and card advantage options, since they're the most in need of sprucing up. Then, in Section 2, we'll discuss the deck's endgame, as well as a few budget honorable mentions. And finally, I'd like to spend the 3rd section discussing potential future upgrades for this deck. Let's get started with Part 1. Because of this commander's abilities, he ends up having a pretty interesting relationship with card advantage, including the ways that he accrues advantage by dealing with problem enemy permanents. There's a lot to get into here, including some kinda complicated stuff. So it turns out there's actually one last piece of housekeeping that I need to do before we go any further. If you look closely on Ranar's EDHREC page, you may see the cards Rest in Peace, Samurai of the Pale Curtain, and Altar of Dementia dotted around it. These are a little curious at first. I mean, it's good grave hate, but what are these doing here precisely? Well, there's some important context to note here. According to Ranar's original wording, a card like Samurai or Rest in Peace was able to create an infinite loop with Ranar and the Altar. By sacrificing a spirit, that object would not be considered dying, but instead would be put directly into exile, which would trigger Ranar's ability, since technically that qualifies as exiling a permanent from the battlefield, prompting him to make a new spirit token. Lather, rinse, repeat, and Ranar would go infinite. Note that I've been using the past tense here. This was a combo, but it is no longer. Ranar has received errata, changing his oracle text. Rather than creating a token whenever you exile a card from your hand or a permanent from the battlefield, he now creates a token whenever one or more cards are put into exile from your hand, or a spell or ability you control exiles one or more permanents from the battlefield. This is relevant because the altars, which allow the spirits to be sacrificed in the first place, do not count as a spell or ability that puts a permanent into exile. They are a cost, not an ability that caused something to be exiled. Even though it's the Rest in Peace that is causing the exile clause, it still considers what the source of the death, or in this case the exile, would be. As another example, an opponent casting a kill spell on one of our creatures would also cause that creature to eventually be exiled, but since it's an opponent's spell, Ranar wouldn't care about it and wouldn't make a token. And as a quick final note, this errata also applies to Hero of Bredegard's first line of text too. Sorry, I know this is complicated. Basically, long story short, there's a history of combo that no longer works with Ranar anymore, so you will not see these cards in this upgrade. Alright, I think that's enough. I've gone way too long without actually addressing the cards in this very deck list, so I need to start making changes before I go haywire. We're jumping in. Up first, Return to Dust. There's been plenty of debate about this card, and look, I like that when you use it to exile something, Ranar makes a spirit, but I'm firmly in the camp that Crush Contraband is actually a more flexible card, and it will also make us a spirit token. It can't tag 2 artifacts or 2 enchantments, but it can get 2 objects at instant speed, and that is more relevant to us more often, especially since it lets us leave up mana for our other tricky instants and foretell spells. That's really big. After that, I can't say I'm a fan of Banishing Light. I do like it in theory, I guess. Again, when we exile something, Ranar gives us the token, but I almost feel like I'd prefer a Detention Sphere instead of this, and even that one I'm kinda iffy on. These enchantments can be destroyed, releasing whatever we contain, and that's tough. And once again, it's also sorcery speed. I'm a bigger fan of just Reality Shift. It also exiles, which means that Ranar also gives us a token, and it's just more permanent. While it can't hit any card type, it does hit the things that we are most often concerned about, and it can do so at instant speed. Up next, hey, Nico, I'm sorry, but your saga is not great? The second chapter is especially limited. We only have 17 cards that it would work on, several of which wouldn't even need 2 mana to cast them, and the Spell Reclamation chapter is just super inconsistent and limited. All of these abilities are things that we can and will upgrade in different ways, but we don't need this specific card to do it. And let's again circle around to that number, 17 cards with Foretell. That's not a lot, which is why, much to my dismay, I eventually came to realize that Vega the Watcher rarely draws that many cards for us. There are only 17 cards that it will work on, which is barely a quarter of the non-land cards in our deck. I think Vega looks really good in theory, but it doesn't work out in practice, which is a shame because drawing cards is something that I want us to amp up in this deck. It is not hard to empty out our hand really quickly. That's alright though, because there are some really fun solutions that we can put in place of this card to help make sure that we never run out of cards in hand. The first I'll propose is a Blink fan favorite, Watcher for Tomorrow. Like the land cycle, it has Hideaway, looking at the top 4 cards of the deck and tucking one away for later, which will be put into our hand when it leaves the battlefield. With multiple Blink effects, this is great card selection, and it also has the upside of fitting into our deck's rad theming of hiding cards face down. Remember though that Hideaway does mean that this card enters the battlefield tapped. After that, I'd like to suggest an unexpectedly secretly powerful card, Distant Melody. This is a tribal spell, for sure, but Ranar is a spirit that makes spirit tokens. We have a few other spirits in the deck, not too many, but that doesn't actually matter. It's really easy for us to foretell or blink just a few things here and there and wind up with 5 or 6 random tokens just lying around, making this a quick draw 6 or draw 7 for just 4 mana. I think this is a really important deck building lesson. A deck doesn't need to be tribal for it to still make use of tribal payoff cards. That'll do it for section 1, so let's move on now to part 2. Let's talk about how this deck wins the game. Ranar can make a bunch of 1/1 spirits, and that can add up, but it may take some patience and foresight. If we're going to lean into that ghostly army as a definite part of our win condition, we've got to be clever about it. There aren't currently a lot of reliable, overt game enders in the average deck. It does, in fact, potentially run the risk of many other Azorius decks, where it takes a long time to finally wrap things up. But we ought to take a moment to recognize what this deck does to snowball into an army, and it's a detail that I think can pass some players by when just glancing over the deck list. Ranar basically oversees a perpetual motion machine. Flicker Wisp can blink Charming Prince, making a token. On the end step, Prince can then blink the Wisp, making another token. Wisp comes back next turn, blinking the Prince again. Or all of this can be done with Yorion, one of the biggest and baddest blinkers out there. Every round, these sequences will add up to a pile of tons of tokens, slowly building up into a very big and very problematic flying force. Point being, we can't just look for big signposts that shout win condition on them. This deck's win conditions are numerous and subtle, and rely upon knowing its synergies, not just upon casting individual haymakers. Thus, I'm going to look for improvements in some off-the-wall places. When first looking through the deck's mana accelerants, I'm displeased with the diamonds. They're just not stellar mana rocks, the first kind of thing that you would cut on a higher budget. And at first, I was actually unsure if this deck even had enough mana accelerants at all, since there are only like 7 mana rocks here in the artifact section. However, I then started sifting through the creatures, aka the blink targets, and I did find several other land-searching creatures there. So we do have a lot of mana accelerants, but a few of them are at 4 mana, which is the same mana cost as our commander. Not untenable, but also not necessarily reliable. And I get that it's probably strange for me to be discussing mana accelerants in a section about win conditions, but I promise this is relevant. I've got 2 swaps I'd like to make here because there are some 3 mana rocks we could be playing that I think will make a fun difference for us. This is a bit of a journey, but I'd like to look at Empyrean Eagle and this here Commander Sphere. Empyrean Eagle feels like a victim of the deck's hard-to-pin-down identity. It's one of the creatures that doesn't have an ability relevant to blink or to foretell, putting it into a weird limbo. Buffing up our spirit tokens is a noble goal, but if that's our goal, I feel like there are a lot of other anthems we could be using that might be more powerful than this, or at the very least that aren't as killable as this creature. I mean, there's also the Spirit Lord in this average deck list, but he at least provides hexproof, so he not only buffs up our tokens but also protects our commander. Of course, this deck isn't on a very big budget at all, so we can't just add in expensive haymakers, but I also don't think we need to. I'd just like to swap the Eagle over to a Heraldic Banner. All our tokens are white spirits anyway, so this gives us one more piece of mana acceleration, while also being a hard-to-remove anthem effect that will give our tokens more power in the air. That is splendid. But, as I mentioned before, I'm also critiquing Commander Sphere here. It's a perfectly good card, to be sure, but it's not thrilling, at least not in the ways that a Strixhaven Stadium would be thrilling. Tons of tiny flying tokens are a recipe for a surprise stadium win condition. This thing is goofy and perfect for a deck that likes to keep its enemies on their toes. The next card I want to address will be weird, but I guess I'm going to talk about Sun Titan again. I know it's famous, but I've just never personally loved Sun Titan, even in Blink decks. There are only 18 non-land cards it could even target here, and 10 of those are artifacts that aren't likely to end up in the graveyard all that often anyway. And okay, yes, it can get lands back from the yard, but there aren't even fetch lands in this average deck, so I don't think that's a good justification in this instance either. Sun Titan can be used in combos, but I'm not seeing any in this average deck list, so that also isn't enough to really love it. I'm not begrudging the use of Sun Titan, I've just rarely found myself enthused by it and often found myself in a position where it didn't have a target to get back, and that's especially true here. So when it comes to recurring things, I just think an Archaeomancer would make a better fit for this deck. It gets back those valuable Blink spells, it resummons Foretell cards for Ranar to use again, netting us more spirits, and combined with cards like Eerie Interlude, it makes our creatures especially hard to kill. Having this little guy around helps us recur our most valuable spells over and over, not only making us nearly impossible to kill, but since so many of our spells also involve exile, he'll also help us produce a butt-ton more tokens too. This guy is super fun and super tricky, and he's just a common. Finally, I want to remark upon Ghostly Prison. I found it interesting that this card was in the deck, but that Propaganda and Windborn Muse were not. I think this is in no small part because Ghostly Prison was in the original pre-constructed deck for Ranar. And when one effect appears in the deck, but the others don't, this always, to me, begs the question, should the other effects also be present to add redundancy, or should this singular version of the effect be removed because it's out of place? In this case, I began to suspect that it was the latter. Propaganda only shows up in 6% of the 2,000 Ranar decks in the EDH Rec database, and Windborn Muse doesn't show up on the page at all. That's really telling. If this effect was high demand for this commander, I think those numbers would be a lot higher. And in my own experience, where Ranar can make a lot of tokens anyway, dealing with multiple creatures isn't too difficult for this deck in the first place. Thus, I'm going to follow the lead of the Propaganda and cut this effect to make room for one more card that will help us make our deck more lethal. And what card is it that I want to add? Oh, just a little old cat. It's just a little blinky boy, which doesn't look like much until it gets paired up with a Restoration Angel and starts to go to town. Unlike our other flicker effects, these two creatures bring back their targets immediately, not at the end step, which means they can flicker each other over and over and over again, while Ranar looks on and therefore creates an infinite number of spirits as a result. Yeah, that seems pretty game-ending to me. It's not immediate, you still have to wait to be able to attack with them all, and could totally get blown out by Rakdos Charms and Ink Shields, but personally, that's the space I like my combos to line up. A really funny interaction that feels like it really resonates with the commander deck, and which has tons of room for interaction from wary opponents. Oh, P.S. I'm swapping out a few lands too. We have too many tap lands here, and also Opal Palace is just really out of place. Basics will do fine, and our Spectral Deluge will thank us for having a few more islands anyway. Before moving on to Section 3, I briefly want to list a couple of honorable mentions for lower budget players. The original average deck was already pretty low budget compared to a lot of the other averages we see, but even so, these three cards here might not be in reach for all players, and I have some small suggestions if you don't happen to own them. Skull Clamp is awesome to use on a bunch of 1/1 spirits, but it's not too bad if you don't own one. Honestly, even like a Fibblethip will work here. We've got a ton of blink spells, so another blink target that draws a card won't just draw a card, it could draw tons of cards as we continually flicker our board over a bunch of turns. As for the Epiphany, extra turn spells in general are around a high price tag, so I don't think there's a direct replacement here, but you could look into the new Drogskull Cavalry if you really want to give all of the spirit tokens in the deck some extra punch. This is a matter of personal comfort for sure, but if you like blink and combat, it's a worthwhile card to investigate. And finally, Thassa is over $10 and a brilliant blinker, but I'm gonna suggest a very weird replacement instead. Salt Skitter is kind of brilliant for a budget blinky card. Not because it blinks other things, it just constantly flickers itself, basically every single turn. Ranar will see this, spit out tons of tokens every round, and laugh his way to the bank. The official swaps are done, and this is normally the place I would show you the full decklist and wrap things up, but I hope you won't mind if I hold you for one section longer. This deck is all about foretelling, so let's take some time to foretell this deck's future. Because this deck is so flexible, I didn't feel comfortable naming any specific path that it, quote, should go down. There are some players for whom Foretell will be the main appeal of this commander, and there are some for whom the spirits are the main draw. Some players really will like combo, and others might just like blink, but really actually want to avoid combo. There are tons of different directions to go down. So for this section, let's just observe some of the different paths that could be in this commander's future, and what the cost of those paths would be. That way you can decide which of these directions feels like the right one for you. A lot of the best or most obvious future upgrades for this deck were very far out of its budget range. There are, of course, the obvious value pieces, from Smothering Tithe to Psych Rift to Rhystic, but everyone already knows those. The single most common upgrade for any Ranar player, heck, any Azorius player, is the Blue-White Talisman. But that needs a reprint stat, because its price tag is absolutely just silly. Like I said, I wasn't a huge fan of the diamonds, but I mean, they will do. As 2-mana ramp goes, they don't cost like $15. Anyway, I think it's also fair to note that since the original deck contains a reconnaissance mission, players could also look into Coastal Piracy and Bident of Thassa too, so that all those spirits yield many more returns in combat. Those are usually around $3-ish right now, which puts them out of budget for this video since the prices were so tight, but they're very fun upgrades I'd recommend first and foremost. In addition to this, the original deck also contained a soul pair of shoes and a singular eerie interlude. I think it's fair if players want to therefore also make room for a pair of greaves and a ghostway. These do come with caveats beyond just their prices though. Shroud is good protection, but this deck does like to target its own stuff a lot, so Shroud could occasionally get in the way sometimes. I think it's still a worthwhile upgrade, but it's a personal call. And Ghostway is a great blink card, but it's indiscriminate, so it would undo all of our tokens, which might not be what players are looking for. If you really like the blink effects, this could still totally be worth it, but if you're building up the tokens side more, this is an upgrade you may want to avoid. In fact, let's discuss the more token-tastic future Ranar deck. Right off the bat, a deck that makes this many tokens should probably look into a Cathar's Crusade. And boy howdy, Divine Visitation sounds pretty darn nice. Foretell a card and make an angel instead of a spirit? Play a Flicker Wisp and make an angel instead of a spirit? This looks like it'll get out of hand really fast. Of course, taking any of these paths means removing something from the deck to make room for them, and I think it's reasonable to say that some of the lackluster Foretell cards may work their way out of this deck in favor of these other synergies. Bouncing a creature, for example, is really cute, but small. Cosmos Charger may find itself with fewer and fewer relevant targets and thus work itself out of the deck over time. Again, some players will totally prefer the Foretell parts of this deck, and that's totally cool. But if you are going to choose to go down something like a tokens or a more blink-tastic route, then the Foretell cards are the most likely candidates to get cut to make room for those types of upgrades. It feels weird for the Foretell deck to lose Foretell cards, but I don't think this is actually a very sad thing at all. Foretell is a really fun engine and a super fun theme upon which to predicate an entire deck, but just because Ranar's first ability is all about Foretell doesn't mean he's obligated to always be that type of deck, especially when his token-making effect can be so powerfully used with blink strategies. And as I already mentioned before, he is playing around in space we've seen other Azorius decks already do, but he's also still able to carve out a unique space for himself within those niches. In fact, let's round out this speculative section by highlighting some fun future blink cards that Ranar could use. Sword of Blink and Ramp is a delicious piece of work, giving us excellent protection, ramp, value, and because of Ranar's ability, board presence too. Or with the Thassas and teleportation circles already in the deck, Conjurer's Closet could be right behind them, giving us even more end-of-turn action. And of course, a Blink deck loves its Panharmonicon too. Double value? Don't mind if I do. Oh, and you might explore changing to snow basics as well, because Arkham's Astrolabe, a 1-mana cantrip and a very efficient blink target, can draw a whole lot of cards over time. Any one of these paths could be fun to explore, but the important point is that Ranar can explore them, and can explore many of them, and isn't bound to a singular destiny, so I hope these suggestions are useful to your future upgrades. Alright, now I'll get to the full deck list. I'm glad I got to spend more time examining Ranar. He's a commander I'd originally thought I had the measure of and was going to overlook, but he's one whose versatility I really grew to appreciate over time. You can find a link to the deck list in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you enjoyed watching the Ever-Watchful, and if you have any other recommendations you'd like to make for your fellow foretellers, make sure you leave them down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.